Imagine this: a quiet evening in a small suburban town. The streets are calm, the faint glow of streetlights reflecting off parked cars. It's the kind of night where you wouldn't expect anything extraordinary to happen. But for U.S. Army General Marcus Carter, this evening would mark a moment he would never forget. A moment that would expose the raw truth about prejudice and power in the most shocking way possible. General Carter, a decorated officer with a career spanning decades, was the epitome of discipline, honor, and service. His record was impeccable, his reputation spotless, and his devotion to his country undeniable. But as he drove home from a community event, wearing his uniform with pride, something he had never expected was waiting for him just down the road. The faint blue and red glow of police lights appeared in his rearview mirror. At first, General Carter thought it might be a routine traffic stop. Perhaps his taillight was out, or maybe he had unknowingly rolled through a stop sign. He slowed down, pulled over, and waited patiently for the officer to approach. Little did he know, this encounter would be far from routine. The officer, a tall, stern-faced man named Officer Daniels, approached the car with an intensity that immediately raised questions. From the start, his tone was harsh, his demeanor cold. License and registration, Daniels barked without so much as a greeting. Carter, ever respectful, nodded and calmly handed over his credentials. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, keeping his voice steady and polite. But instead of addressing the question, Daniel's eyes narrowed as he glanced at the documents. His expression hardened further when he saw the name and title. "General Marcus Carter?" he asked, his voice dripping with disbelief, almost mockery. "Yes, sir," Carter replied, maintaining his composure despite the tension simmering in the air. "United States Army." For a moment, there was silence. Then Daniel sneered, his skepticism unmistakable. "Army, huh? We'll see about that." Without explanation, he gestured for Carter to step out of the vehicle. Confused but compliant, Carter did as he was told. What happened next, though, was nothing short of shocking. Daniels began questioning Carter aggressively, his tone laced with insinuation, his words cutting and accusatory. He seemed uninterested in verifying Carter's identity and more focused on undermining him. "You don't look like no general to me," Daniels said, circling Carter like a predator sizing up its prey. "What are you doing driving a car like this, wearing that uniform? Is this stolen?" Carter felt his stomach twist. It wasn't the first time he had faced prejudice, but this was different. This was blatant, unapologetic, and completely unprovoked. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, injustice burning in his chest. Still, he held his ground, determined not to let anger cloud his judgment. "Officer," he said firmly, "I am who I say I am. If you have any doubts, you're welcome to call on a base or verify my credentials through proper channels." But Daniels wasn't interested in the truth. Instead, his accusations escalated, his words becoming more hostile, his actions more aggressive. The situation spiraled further when Daniels reached for his handcuffs, ignoring Carter's calm explanations and pleas for fairness. And then, just as Daniels grabbed Carter's arm, something incredible happened. A moment that would change the course of the night and leave everyone involved questioning everything they thought they knew about justice, respect, and the power of standing up against wrongdoing. But to find out what happens next, you'll have to keep watching. This story is about more than one incident. It's about a system, a society, and the courage it takes to confront the hardest truths. Stay tuned. The grip of Officer Daniels' hand on General Carter's arm was firm, almost unnervingly so. Carter held his ground, his years of military training keeping him calm, even as his heart raced. He could see the determination in Daniels' eyes, not the kind driven by duty, but by something else, something darker. As Daniels reached for his radio, Carter took a breath and tried again. "Officer, please. I've given you all the identification you need. There's no reason for this to escalate." His voice remained steady, but inside he could feel frustration building. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the principle of it all, the blatant disrespect, the unnecessary hostility, the refusal to see beyond a uniform or a title. Daniels scoffed, shaking his head, as if Carter's calm demeanor only made him more suspicious. "You think you can talk your way out of this? You don't fool me. I've seen plenty like you, acting like they're above the law." His words were laced with contempt, his tone sharp enough to cut through the chilly night air. Carter bit his tongue, resisting the urge to respond with the anger he felt bubbling beneath the surface. He knew better than to let his emotions take control, especially in a situation like this. Instead, he focused on staying composed, knowing that any misstep could be used against him. Meanwhile, a small crowd began to gather at a distance. Curious neighbors peered out from their windows, some stepping outside to get a better look. The flashing lights and raised voices were hard to ignore, and whispers quickly spread through the quiet street. "Isn't that General Carter?" One woman murmured, her voice filled with concern. "Yeah, he's the one who spoke at the community center last week." Another man replied, "What's going on?" Carter noticed the onlookers, but kept his attention on Daniels. He had faced worse situations in war zones, but there was something uniquely unsettling about this. A battle unfolding not on foreign soil, but in his own backyard. Daniels called for backup, his tone sharp and commanding. "I've got a suspicious individual claiming to be military personnel. Possible stolen vehicle. Need another unit to assist." Carter's jaw tightened. Suspicious individual, stolen vehicle. The accusations felt like a slap in the face. He wanted to speak up, to demand an explanation, but he knew the power dynamics at play. Any wrong move could worsen the situation. Minutes felt like hours as they stood there, tension thick in the air. Carter's mind raced with thoughts of his family, his career, his reputation. How had it come to this? He had dedicated his life to serving his country, to protecting the very freedoms that Daniels seemed so eager to strip away in this moment. When the backup unit arrived, 2 officers stepped out of their vehicle. One of them, Officer Hernandez, immediately recognized Carter. Her eyes widened as she took in the scene. "General Carter," she said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "What's going on here?" Before Carter could respond, Daniels interjected. "This man claims he's a general, but something's not adding up. I think the car might be stolen." Hernandez frowned, glancing between Daniels and Carter. She could see the tension, the way Daniels seemed determined to assert his authority regardless of the facts. "Did you verify his ID?" she asked carefully. Daniels waved a dismissive hand. "Working on it." But people like him. He stopped himself, but the implication hung heavy in the air. Hernandez's expression hardened. She stepped closer to Carter, her tone respectful. "General, may I see your identification?" Carter handed over his military ID and driver's license, grateful for her professionalism. Hernandez examined them closely, then looked back at Carter with a nod. "These are legitimate," she said firmly. "This is General Marcus Carter, and he has every right to be here." Daniel's face reddened, but he refused to back down. "That doesn't explain why he was acting suspicious." "Suspicious?" Hernandez raised an eyebrow. "General Carter is a respected member of this community and a high-ranking officer in the United States Army. With all due respect, Officer Daniels, I think you've made a mistake." The crowd, now larger, murmured among themselves. Some pulled out their phones to record, sensing the gravity of what was unfolding. Daniels clenched his jaw, his frustration evident. "Fine," he muttered, though his tone suggested he was anything but fine. He took a step back, but the damage was already done. The air was thick with tension, the crowd's unease palpable. Carter looked at Hernandez, his voice calm but firm. "Thank you, Officer Hernandez. I appreciate your help." But as Carter turned back toward his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Daniels stood a few feet away, his glare burning into Carter's back. It wasn't just about this one interaction. It was about a mindset, a prejudice that ran deeper than a single incident. As Carter drove away, the weight of the night settled on his shoulders. He knew he couldn't simply let this go. It wasn't just about clearing his name or moving past an uncomfortable encounter. It was about accountability, about ensuring that what happened to him wouldn't happen to someone else. In the days that followed, Carter began to piece together the next steps. He spoke with his attorney, reached out to community leaders, and even considered addressing the media. But as he delved deeper into the situation, he discovered something that left him reeling. There was more to Officer Daniels than met the eye: a history of complaints, allegations of misconduct, patterns of behavior that pointed to a troubling abuse of power. And Carter wasn't the only one who had been affected. What Carter would do with this information, how he would navigate the delicate balance between seeking justice and maintaining his own integrity, was a question he couldn't yet answer. But one thing was clear: this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about a system that needed to change, a society that needed to confront its own blind spots. And as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, Carter knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But he also knew he wasn't alone. The community, his family, his fellow soldiers, they were all watching, waiting to see what would happen next. And so the stage was set for a battle unlike any Carter had faced before. One that would test his resolve, his character, and his belief in the values he had spent his life defending. The days following the incident left General Marcus Carter grappling with a mix of frustration and resolve. He sat at his dining table, his military plaques and framed family photos staring back at him like silent witnesses to the injustice he had experienced. His wife, Angela, poured him a cup of coffee, her eyes filled with concern. "You've been quiet, Marcus," she said gently, taking a seat across from him. "I know you're trying to process everything, but you don't have to go through this alone." Marcus looked at her, grateful for her steady presence. She had been his anchor through deployments, long nights, and moments of doubt. But this felt different. This wasn't an enemy he could face on a battlefield. This was home, his home. "I keep thinking about what could have happened," he said finally. "If I hadn't stayed calm, if Officer Hernandez hadn't shown up when she did, things could have ended very differently." Angela reached for his hand. "But they didn't," she said softly. "You're here, and you have a voice. You can do something about this." Her words stayed with him as he began making calls. The first was to his attorney, Charles, a sharp and determined man who had handled cases of civil rights violations before. Charles listened intently as Marcus recounted every detail of the incident. "Marcus, this isn't just about what happened to you," Charles said after a long pause. "This is about holding the system accountable. Officer Daniels has a history, and if we dig deeper, I'm certain we'll find others who've been affected by his actions." As the investigation unfolded, Marcus learned more about Daniels' troubling record. There were multiple complaints against him, allegations of racial profiling, excessive force, and unprofessional conduct. Yet, each time, the cases had been swept under the rug or dismissed due to lack of evidence. Meanwhile, word of the incident spread through the community. Marcus had always been well respected, not just for his military service, but for his active involvement in local initiatives. He had mentored youth, spoken at schools, and participated in neighborhood cleanups. The idea that someone like him could be treated so unjustly struck a chord with many. At the community center, a group of young men approached him after one of his mentorship sessions. One of them, a teenager named Jalen, hesitated before speaking up. "General Carter, can I ask you something?" Jalen's voice was unsure, but his eyes were determined. "How do you stay so calm when people treat you like that?" "I don't think I could have done it." Marcus considered the question carefully. "It's not easy," he admitted, "but staying calm doesn't mean letting it slide. It means finding a way to fight back without losing control. That's how we create change." Jalen nodded, but the look in his eyes told Marcus that the boy had already experienced his own share of prejudice. It was a painful reminder that this fight wasn't just his. It was one that spanned generations. While Marcus worked to bring attention to the incident, Officer Daniels faced his own struggles. Behind the scenes, the Internal Affairs Department launched a review of his conduct. Daniels, feeling the pressure, doubled down on his version of events, insisting that his actions were justified. To his colleagues, he was a polarizing figure, Some defended him, citing the challenges of law enforcement, while others quietly distanced themselves. One of those colleagues was Officer Hernandez. She couldn't stop thinking about the night of the traffic stop and the way Daniels had handled it. She started asking questions, not just about Daniels, but about the culture within their department. What she uncovered was troubling: a pattern of complaints against certain officers and a lack of accountability from leadership. Hernandez debated what to do with this information. Speaking out could jeopardize her career, but staying silent felt like complicity. She decided to reach out to Marcus. They met at a small coffee shop on the edge of town, away from prying eyes. Hernandez looked nervous, but determined as she slid a folder across the table. "These are copies of reports," she said in a hushed voice. "Complaints that were filed and ignored. Daniels isn't the only one, but he's one of the worst." Marcus opened the folder, his heart sinking as he scanned the pages. The stories were eerily similar to his own: minor traffic stops that escalated unnecessarily, incidents where Daniels had used his authority to intimidate or humiliate. "Thank you," Marcus said sincerely. "I know this wasn't easy for you." Hernandez nodded. "I just want to do what's right. This job is supposed to be about protecting people, not abusing power." As Marcus and his team prepared to take legal action, the media caught wind of the story. News outlets began covering the incident, framing it as part of a larger conversation about policing and racial bias. Marcus appeared in interviews, his calm demeanor and clear message resonating with audiences across the country. "This isn't about hating the police," he said during one interview. "This is about accountability, about ensuring that the people who are supposed to serve and protect us are held to the same standards as everyone else." The growing attention brought both support and backlash. While many rallied behind Marcus, others accused him of trying to smear law enforcement. Social media became a battleground, with hashtags like #JusticeForCarter trending alongside opposing ones like #SupportTheBlue. Amid the chaos, Marcus received an unexpected message. It was from a young woman named Maria, whose brother had been arrested by Daniels under questionable circumstances. She wanted to share her story, and Marcus agreed to meet her. Maria's account was heartbreaking. Her brother, Alex, had been pulled over for a broken taillight, but the encounter quickly escalated. Daniels accused Alex of resisting arrest, and he ended up spending a night in jail. The charges were later dropped, but the experience left Alex shaken and distrustful of the police. "My brother isn't the same," Maria said, her voice trembling. "He used to be so outgoing, but now he's scared to even drive. He feels like he doesn't matter." Marcus listened, his resolve hardening. The fight wasn't just about his own experience anymore. It was about Alex, Jalen, and countless others who had been silenced or dismissed. As the lawsuit against Daniels and the department moved forward, tensions in the town reached a boiling point. Protests erupted, with community members demanding change. Marcus stood at the center of it all, not as a victim, but as a leader determined to see justice served. But the road ahead was far from clear. Daniels wasn't backing down, and the department seemed more focused on protecting its image than addressing the root of the problem. Marcus knew the fight would be long and difficult, but he also knew it was a fight worth having. And as he prepared for the next battle, he couldn't help but wonder, how many more stories like his are out there, waiting to be told? The courtroom was packed. Rows of seats were filled with community members, activists, reporters, and even off-duty officers, all waiting to witness the pivotal moment in a case that had stirred emotions far beyond the town's borders. The air buzzed with tension, whispers passing back and forth like ripples across a pond. General Marcus Carter sat at the plaintiff's table, his posture straight, his eyes steady. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every voice silenced by fear, every moment of injustice that had gone unanswered. Across the room, Officer Daniels sat with his legal team, his face a mask of defiance. His lawyer, a polished man in a dark suit, occasionally leaned over to murmur advice, but Daniels barely seemed to hear him. His eyes darted around the room landing briefly on Marcus before looking away. It was clear that the stakes were just as high for him, but his resolve was driven by pride, not principle. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. The proceedings began with opening statements, each side laying the groundwork for what would be an intense battle of narratives. Marcus' attorney, Charles, painted a vivid picture of systemic issues within the police department, with Daniels as a glaring example of unchecked power. On the other side, Daniels' lawyer framed the case as a misunderstanding blown out of proportion, claiming Marcus was leveraging his status to tarnish a hard-working officer's career. As the witnesses were called, the room braced for revelations. Officer Hernandez was among the first to take the stand. Her testimony was calm but powerful as she detailed the events of that night and the troubling patterns she had observed within the department. She spoke of her decision to come forward, despite the risks, and her belief in the importance of accountability. "I became a police officer to help people," she said, her voice steady but emotional. "But when I saw what was happening, I knew I couldn't stay silent. We have a responsibility to the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be." Daniel's lawyer tried to discredit her, suggesting that her perspective was biased or fueled by personal grievances. But Hernandez held her ground, refusing to let intimidation sway her. Next came Maria, who shared her brother Alex's story with the same raw emotion she had shown when she first met Marcus. Her voice cracked as she described how the encounter with Daniels had changed Alex, how the fear lingered even after the charges were dropped. "It wasn't just about that night," she said. "It's about the way people like Alex, like my family, are treated. It's about feeling like we don't belong, like we're always one wrong move away from losing everything." As she spoke, Marcus watched the jury's faces. Some looked sympathetic, others skeptical. It was clear that the case wasn't just about presenting facts. It was about shifting perspectives, breaking through deeply ingrained biases. Then came the moment Marcus had been preparing for, the moment he took the stand. The room seemed to hold its breath as he recounted the events of that night in painstaking detail. He spoke not just as a plaintiff, but as a leader, someone who had dedicated his life to upholding values of integrity and justice. "I faced enemies on the battlefield," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "But nothing prepares you for the moment when you're treated like the enemy in your own country." That night wasn't about a broken taillight or a routine stop. It was about being seen as less than, about someone using their authority to diminish who I am. Daniel's lawyer pressed hard during cross-examination, trying to paint Marcus as overly sensitive or opportunistic. But Marcus met every question with clarity and grace, refusing to let the narrative be twisted. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, the protests continued. Supporters of Marcus held signs demanding justice, chanting for change. On the other side of the street, counter-protesters waved flags and shouted about respecting law enforcement. The tension mirrored what was unfolding inside, a microcosm of a broader societal divide. As the trial moved into its final days, Charles unveiled the most critical piece of evidence, a recording. It was captured by a bystander during the traffic stop, and it showed the interaction in stark detail. The jury watched as Daniel's tone and actions played out on the screen, the disdain in his voice unmistakable. The recording left little room for interpretation, and murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Daniel's face turned pale as the video played. For the first time, his confident demeanor faltered. His lawyer scrambled to mitigate the damage, arguing that the video lacked context, but the impact was undeniable. By the time both sides rested their cases, the room was thick with anticipation. The jury would deliberate, but the court of public opinion was already in session. Social media exploded with reactions, the video going viral within hours. Marcus's calm composure under pressure and the raw truth of what the recording revealed struck a chord with millions. But as Marcus left the courthouse that evening, he couldn't shake the feeling that the fight wasn't over. The trial was just one part of a much larger battle, one that couldn't be won with a single verdict. Still, he knew this moment mattered. It was a step forward, a chance to challenge the status quo and spark a conversation that desperately needed to happen. As the sun set, casting long shadows over the courthouse steps, Marcus stood quietly for a moment, taking it all in. The crowd of supporters cheered as he walked toward them, but his focus remained on the journey ahead. The climax of this battle was near, but the war for justice was far from over. As the courthouse doors closed behind Marcus, the cheers of supporters echoed faintly in his ears. He had always believed in staying composed under pressure, but tonight he allowed himself a moment to exhale. The case felt like it was finally tipping his favor, especially after the recording. Yet, there was a gnawing feeling in the back of his mind, a sense that something else was brewing just beneath the surface. Angela greeted him at home with a warm hug, but her expression was tinged with unease. "You've done everything you can, Marcus," she said, searching his face. "Whatever happens next, you've already made an impact." Marcus nodded, though her words didn't bring the comfort she intended. His thoughts were interrupted by the vibration of his phone on the kitchen counter. It was Charles. "Marcus," Charles began, his voice cautious. "I just received something. It's unexpected. Can you meet me first thing tomorrow?" Marcus agreed, though Charles's tone left him uneasy. When he arrived at the office the next morning, Charles was waiting with a file in hand and an expression that was difficult to read. "Someone anonymously sent me this," Charles said, pushing the file across the table. "It's Daniel's personnel record, but there's something buried in it I wasn't expecting." Marcus opened the file, scanning the neatly typed pages. At first, it seemed like a standard employment history. Years on the force, commendations, transfers. But then he saw it. A disciplinary note from years ago, marked confidential. It detailed an incident involving Daniels and another officer, Hernandez. "Hernandez?" Marcus asked, his brow furrowing. "What does she have to do with this?" Charles leaned forward, his voice low. "According to this report, Daniels was reprimanded for misconduct during a joint operation. Hernandez filed a formal complaint against him back then. It wasn't related to racial bias, but it was serious enough that he should have faced suspension. Instead, it was quietly dismissed, and Hernandez was reassigned." Marcus felt a surge of anger. So they've been protecting him for years, and Hernandez knew this? She might not have had access to this specific report, Charles said carefully, but she clearly knew enough to distrust him. The question is, why was this buried, and why is it surfacing now? Marcus's mind raced. If Daniels had been shielded once, who else had been complicit? And why would someone leak this now, in the middle of the trial? The timing was too perfect to be a coincidence. He thought back to Hernandez's testimony and how she had risked everything to come forward. Was this an act of sabotage meant to discredit her, or something else entirely? That evening, Marcus decided to meet with Hernandez directly. They sat in her car in a secluded parking lot, away from prying eyes. When he showed her the report, she froze, her hands gripping the steering wheel. "I remember this," she said quietly. "It was years ago, before I really understood how things worked in the department. Daniels was reckless, and I called him out. I thought I was doing the right thing, but instead of holding him accountable, they made it clear that I was the problem." She looked at Marcus, her eyes filled with regret. "I tried to forget about it to move on, but it's been eating at me ever since. I didn't think anyone would ever find out." "Someone wanted us to find out," Marcus said. "The question is, why now? And who else might be involved?" The next day in court, the tension was palpable. The leaked report had made its way to the opposing legal team, who wasted no time using it to cast doubt on Hernandez's credibility. They painted her as a disgruntled employee with a personal vendetta against Daniels, suggesting that her testimony was motivated by bitterness rather than truth. Marcus watched Hernandez on the stand, her calm demeanor cracking under the weight of the accusations. It was clear she hadn't anticipated this twist, and it hurt to see someone who had risked so much now being dragged through the mud. But the twists didn't end there. Just as the defense wrapped up their questioning, Charles stood and requested to call a surprise witness, a retired officer who had worked with Daniels years ago. The man's testimony added yet another layer to the conflict. "I stayed quiet for too long. the retired officer admitted, his voice heavy with guilt. Daniels had a pattern of pushing boundaries, of using his badge to intimidate. We all knew it, but the department always found ways to protect him. I wish I'd spoken up sooner. The courtroom was stunned. Daniels shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his confident mask beginning to slip. For the first time, Marcus saw something resembling fear in the officer's eyes. Outside the courthouse, the atmosphere grew more volatile. Supporters of both sides clashed verbally, their arguments escalating into heated debates about systemic injustice and the role of law enforcement. Marcus trying to stay focused, but the weight of it all was beginning to take a toll. As he returned home that evening, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It was a single line. Asterisk, asterisk. Be careful who you trust. Asterisk, asterisk. Marcus stared at the message, a chill running down his spine. The fight for justice was becoming more dangerous than he'd anticipated, and the stakes had just been raised once again.